Prison guards of Reddit, what is the most extreme thing you ever saw happen in your prison? A family member and I used to work at the same prison, and the prisoners knew we were related. My family member got into a minor car accident and had a few weeks off work to recover. Word got out about it to all the prisoners, and I constantly got asked how I was coping because they all heard it was super serious. It wasn't. While one was asking me what happened when we had a lockdown code, so everyone had to go back to their blocks. Came to find out in the incident report that a fight had started because two prisoners heard two different stories on what happened to my family member. Couldn't agree. Started a punch-up and got the whole block of about 80 guys brawling. Whole place got locked down for like 10 hours, all because my family member can't drive. Story 2, this is taking the word extreme to a different level. But when I was a prison guard, female, working in a men's max, I worked in the kitchen. I tried to be firm, fair, and consistent, and it worked. I mean, I went home whole every night. Somehow a few of the prisoners found out it was my birthday, and towards the middle of my shift, they had me come around the office. And there on the table was a 4-layer industrial-size cake with pink frosting. I was touched. They told me to get my piece before everyone else did, and not even 10 minutes later it was gone. Story 3. My dad was in prison, and the craziest day he experienced was sometime around the end of his first week in. He had been keeping his head down, but one of the other inmates told him to meet him outside by the corner of one of the building during their free time outside. He was hesitant because he didn't want to get into trouble right out of the gate. He looked toward the corner of the building and saw a small group of guys huddled, and he got even more concerned. Just as he was going to walk away, they noticed him and called him over. He accepted. These guys were passing around a cantaloupe and sharing it. Each guy had a spoon, and they'd take a bite and pass it on. Story 4. One of my former teachers used to provide mental health services in the county jail. She said the worst thing she saw was an inmate who went insane. He was quiet and polite and doing a small amount of time for a minor crime. But then, he got in one small fight and was moved to max, and something in him snapped. He decompensated so quickly that by day 4, he was smearing feces on the wall and singing nursery rhymes. He was taken away by ambulance and was never seen again. Story 5. Not a guard, but a prison nurse had to respond to a cell fight where one man hit another man's nose. The most extreme one I heard, though, was from a doctor I worked with. My first patient hit her own eyeball. Story 6. I did a bit in Florida about 4 years ago. While I was inside, they let my cell block come into the common area to watch the iHeartRadio Award. Never would have watched it on my own, but it was nice to have the distraction. This was the summer that Ariana Grande had that One Less Problem song, and she performed it right before J.Lo came to the stage. Now, I'm in with mostly Puerto Rican inmates, so J.Lo being on was a big damn deal. Some dude just loses his crap during the Ariana Grande song. Some of the dudes said he was into little girls or something, and throws a very lightweight plastic chair at the Didn't think it would do much damage, but it busted the LCD. Damn. Broke. Loose. Dudes weren't going to get a chance to see J.Lo's ass, and they wanted beat for it. I ran my gringo behind back to my cell, and a 60-man brawl ensued. All of this to say, in the midst of the insanity, one guy bit another guy's thumb off and swallowed it. Story 7. Not mine, but my dad's. First day he was there, a riot occurred because some get prisoner thought it would be funny if he stole a book from a prisoner and blamed it on someone else. Long story short, the guy who was blamed had all 4 of his limbs broken and his face beaten. Apparently, they already had beef between them. Story 8. I used to be a corrections officer. I found an inmate beaten up and his neck snapped in the gym one night. Gave him CPR until medics arrived, but he was too far gone. Story 9. Between fights. Worst one that got me was I cut down a hanger. He went into fight mode, swinging at us. We got him to the ground and handcuffed him and pinned him on the floor. He started to cry, begging us to hit him as we tried to keep him from banging his head on the floor. That was my first hanging and stuck with me ever since. I was working a pod and had someone throw a melted down shoe heel in a sofa can at me. Think hot melted rubber. It mainly got on my shirt, so I was fine, but started fighting with the guy. I had him pinned on the ground. With 64 offenders around me, I had lost my cuffs in the fight. They had fell out away from me. Another offender I had known for a while assisted me, handing me my cuffs and holding the guy's legs down. I was able to drag that one offender out due to the fact the offenders on the pod were throwing stuff at us. The offender who helped me got his time reduced, and I wrote him a letter for the parole board and spoke on his behalf. He got out. Works a good woodworking job, $24 an hour, and writes to the prison with updates on how he is. He has a girlfriend and a baby on the way. Happiest story I have of that. Story 10. No a prison guard, but I work in a psych hospital. Worst thing I saw was a man fingering his stoma in his stomach so hard. He was repeating duck me. Couldn't get that crap out of my head for a few days. That guy was a mess. Story 11. My dad was a P officer in the prison service for a couple decades. He has a few stories. One that I always remember was there was this one kid who was about 16 years old, but he was about 6 feet 4 inches and built like a tank. He also had a bit of a temper. One day when my dad is supervising the gym workout, he looks over towards the benches, and this kid picks up a 34 kilograms dumbbell, lifts it above his head, and starts to swing it down onto another inmate who is laying on one of the benches. My dad manages to sprint over, grab this kid, and pin him against the wall just in time to stop him from killing the other inmate. At this point, my dad is thinking, if this kid wants to fight, he is probably going to win. But luckily, he had a good reputation, so the kid didn't fight, but also other inmates alerted other guards. If he was able to carry through with that swing, that inmate's head would literally have exploded. There is no other outcome to that. Nothing ended up happening with the kid. The prison head didn't deem it to be much of an issue because no one was hurt. So my dad brought the 34 kilograms dumbbell into the meeting to show her. She didn't care. Ignored it because it makes her prison look better on paper. Story 12. I was working in the X house. My prison had 3 areas: general population, STC for somewhat mentally unstable IMs, and the X house shaped like an X for seriously mentally ill guys that would throw poop, hit themselves, etc. I was on the SEG wing, even though most cells in the X house were like SEG anyway. This area had another officer to watch it specifically, so I was called over to watch a guy so that he doesn't hurt himself. He was completely naked with nothing else in his cell, and I have to stand just outside the door and watch him. So he's trying to do everything to get a reaction out of me, but I'm Stoneface Phillips, documenting every 5 minds what he's doing. He climbs up on the bed, takes his junk in one hand, and starts stroking. He takes a finger from his other hand and wets it in his mouth. The now wet finger goes behind him, right inside. And then he starts yelling my last name. We all have name tag. Awake 30? Awake 30? Awake 30. Then after he's done doing that, he walks up to the door. These are steel doors with just a window for seeing into the cell. We're basically face to face with this window between. Just below the window is a chuck hole, which is a tiny door for passing food trays through. Thankfully, it was closed, because I looked down at the chuck hole and see yellow liquid coming out from the sides of it. I took a few steps back and continued my watch. I wasn't going to let him get a reaction out of me. Story 13. I have many stories, and many about this particular prisoner, but one stands out to me the most. Doing a count one day, everyday stuff, and it involves looking through trap windows to make sure everyone is present and breathing. Get to this prisoner's cell. Let's call him Prisoner X. Now, this prisoner has a long history of abuse. As a result, he is an absolutely chronic pleasure himself. The amount of times I've had to have conversations with him while he's going to town on his ham bone are innumerable. Anyway, doing a count with a female officer, she looks through the trap and immediately recoils. Now all I can hear is a loud buzzing sound and the sounds of furious pleasure. I decide to check the trap against the warnings of my offsider. Should have listened. Turns out he was using the unit's hair clipper, but he had them wrapped in a glove, turned on, and shoved squarely up inside. All I could see was the cord plugged into the wall leading into his loudly buzzing inside, and him giving his old feller the exercise of its life. Story 14. Working in the emergency department, we had a prisoner come in unconscious and covered in blood. We got him cleaned up and counted at least 12 wounds to his head and face. They were shallow, but the force caused the wounds to look like gashes, so stitches or staples were out of the question. He had even more wounds on his arms from trying to cover his head during the attack. We couldn't save one of his ears, and he was still unconscious when I clocked out, according to an employee that still works at that hospital. The prisoner was transferred to a trauma center the following morning. He had multiple fractures and spinal damage. Apparently, he was a snitch and got jumped by other prisoners. Story 15. I was just an inmate, but when I was locked up in the Bronx, I remember people making shivs out of the toothbrushes we were given. Also, one guy screamed to prove that the Co's didn't give a duck about what went on in the holding cells. No one checked on us. Also, the Kios would purposely throw rival gang members into the same cell. I'll never forget some of their screams as they got hauled off into enemy territory. Also saw people get beat by the Co's and pepper sprayed in the face while incapacitated, then left in handcuffs for hours so they couldn't wash the spray off. Their screams were pretty bad too. One dude had a seizure, and it took about an hour for a medical response. Story 16. An old manager of mine was a corrections officer at a woman's prison around here. He had tons of stories, most revolving around guards having relations with inmates. So biggest story was guards were getting BJ from them. Eventually, a bunch of the guards had a group sex with a fair sum of the inmates, and she got quite a bit more. After that, she turned all her hairs into one of the higher-ups and told them to run DNA on them. They'll be the names of all the guards she listed off. Sure enough, she alone got 20 guards fired. Story 17. Not a co, but no maintenance staff. One inmate had a court date, so left for the day. Apparently during his day out, he managed to acquire a loose screw. Not big or anything. Apparently he found it on the floor of the transport van. Anyway, once back in his cell, he decides to use the screw to drill a hole in the plexiglass window of his door. Mind you, the doors are a layer of plexiglass and then steel grating. Anyway, he drills 2 holes, one at the top and one at the bottom of about a 2 feet tall window. He does this between co-patrols, who are supposed to do a walk around every 15 minutes. The inmate then proceeds to tear his bedding and ravel it into a string, which he feeds through the upper hole and back down through the lower hole. Using the friction of the bedding, he literally saws a giant hole in the plexiglass, using nothing but his bedding. When questioned, he informed the guards that this took him roughly 11 hours to accomplish without a single co-noticing it. He didn't escape. Like I said, there is still the steel grating. He literally just did this as a duck you to the guards, and he had the spare time. Story 18. Not a prison guard, but was told this story by a kitchen supervisor working in a minimum security prison. He was supervising on the morning shift when he went to use the inmate bathroom in the kitchen, because the other supervisor was using the officer bathroom and he really had to go. The inmate bathrooms had doors, full metal ones, and stalls, unlike in the rest of the compound, which just had open stalls, but without locks on them. The inmates who worked in the kitchen would pleasure himself in them and had adult magazines hidden under the sink, so he was always careful to knock beforehand, not wanting to walk in on someone mid-stroke. Story 19. With all the serious ones, I thought I would give a funny one too. Worked in a youth correctional facility. The units were Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta, etc. On Charlie Dorm, there were 3 openly homosexual youth who were way over the top when it came to stereotypical behavior. Talked in lisps, used red Kool-Aid powder to make lipstick, tied their sweater arms together to make a purse, etc. Well, one day they are walking down the hall together, see me in my office, and said, "Hey, Act-Teach, check this out." Then the 3 of them dropped and did the Charlie's Angels pose. I laughed my ass off. Story 20. A professor of mine worked in the commissary while he was going through university and loved to tell us about how in the movies, it's all about substances and cigarettes. But he made his money smuggling in off-brand ramen, noodles, chips, and pop. I'm sure other people were handling the substances and cigarettes, but for the life of him, he couldn't figure out why, if people were willing to pay ridiculous markups on items that won't get you sent to jail. As an aside, the scariest moment he would talk about was one prisoner fighting off 3 others by using a syringe. Story 21. I have a friend who's a prison guard. Just the other day, he was telling me about an inmate who called over one of the guards and held out his hand holding something in his fist, not really thinking anything. The guard holds his hand out and the inmate drops what he was holding into the guard's hand. As he starts walking away, the guard looks in his hand and sees the inmate's balls. I didn't ask if they were still in the sack, but I'll find out next time I see my mate. Then a few weeks later, the same inmate lost his junk. Story 22. I don't think I saw anyone mention the gunner. There will be people who just drop their pants and start viciously jacking their banana the moment they see a female co. Doesn't matter if they are. Fat, skinny, ugly, pretty, deformed, just has to be female of some sort, and they will stare them down and go to town on themselves. Now the thing is, this is not rare. This is not one of those every once in a while things. So many do it. It's glorified within prison. The punishment for something like this is just going to confinement for 15, 60 days. No extra sex charges or anything. It's normal. Super ducked up, though. Story 23. This is an old story here in Sweden one day at a corrections facility called Norrtäljeanstalten. The 2 guards on duty forgot to lock the doors to the cells, kitchen, and everything, so the prisoners broke out. The thing was that they didn't escape, but instead built a blanket fort, baked a chocolate cake, ate the chocolate cake, and watched TV all night till the guards came back to the unit the next morning. The prisoners had full access to knives, forks, spoons, and anything you can find in a kitchen, and they decided to just watch TV in a blanket fort and eat cake. The 2 guards got 5 without pay, and a warning since nothing major happened. Story 24. Dietai, female teach, volunteer, in a minimum security male prison. Security level of an incarcerated person doesn't correlate directly with the crimes they're incarcerated for. It's more about their public safety risks, such as reoffending. What that means is my class of minimum security guys has all sorts of offenders in it. Our class is held a few times a week in a separate building than the main prison, trailer, portable. My most extreme story is one from springtime. It couldn't have been a more gorgeous day, and everyone was chatty about it. Suddenly, a bit of commotion in the back of the class. Hey, hey, teacher lady. I head to the back of the trailer to check things out. Everyone's gathered around a window. What? Is there some new co on the block, or maybe a transfer inmate they're all ragging on? I swear these guys are just... I thought to myself, preparing for some juvenile nonsense. At that moment, I saw what they could see. A mama cat and her 3 kittens trotting across the yard and settling in under some daffodils for a nap. A collective awe rose up from the trailer, quickly covered up with abrupt subject changes, crap talking, and class questions. I can't help but smile every time I think about it. Moral of the story, they're just people. Maybe they did some crafty things, like real crafty things, or maybe they didn't and they're in there wrongly. Maybe they've been rehabilitated, or maybe they haven't. Hell, maybe they never will be. But everyone likes kittens. Story 25. I'm correctional officer, but still in training. Told this story by my instructor, who was a co for 15 years. He was working in segregation, essentially solitary confinement, but not that extreme in the sense that the inmates here do get to converse with other inmates and do get to populate outside during rec time for only 2 hours each day. But anyways, one of the inmates also had mental health issues, and after 15 days serving in segregation, psychological issues can form. So it got past 3 weeks, and this inmate who was already did not have a sane mind went absolutely crazy. Took a razor blade and started to hit his arm. Once that happened, they have to suit up in protective gear and enter the cell with a body-sized shield. After pulling him out and sending him to medical to get treatment, he is sent back to his cell after the stitches were sewn. 2 hours pass, and the inmate takes another razor blade and starts hit his stomach. It was a cycle of him going to medical and getting stapled up, and going back to his cell to open his wounds back up until he was put in a turtle suit, straitjacket. These types of experiences aren't abnormal for mental health patients being put in segregation. Story 26. Working in the towers my first weekend, we had a lockdown situation. Rival gang member managed to get hostage with a shiv. He managed to wedge the door shut, and we all watched as he slowly destroyed his enemy. Pretty ducked up, still remembering the look on his face. He was charged with first-degree murder, was switched out to isolated confinement. He had been planning this. I was not in charge of investigating, so all I really remember about the door, Jam was a well-timed pillow on the automatic door shutting. Story 27. My dad did some time. Before he got locked up, he was into construction. For this reason, he was chosen to operate a backhoe off campus. So a guard and him are out there, and Dad was running the backhoe. Dad was so happy to be outside for a while and was having a blast when the guard told him to shut off the backhoe. The guard asked Dad if he wanted to run. Dad said hell no. He wanted to get out of prison ASAP. Then the guard tells him he's going to run into town and get lunch and leaves my dad unattended. When he came back, he brought Dad some leftover Pizza Hut. So for the first time in 3 years, he got to go out and work and eat food from the outside. He said it was the only time he was happy in prison. Story 28. I was a mailroom employee at the unit in Texas that houses death row. For security reasons, most of death row inmates had their mail constantly scanned or read, while other inmates just had them searched for contraband. This whole process was a NEGIT process out in place after a governor was threatened from doctor. Then bringing the mail to the inmates and telling them you read it and found some crap was terrifying because they obviously never liked and often threatened abuse. The stuff you read is ducking insane. The worst one I ever read had to have been the one of an inmate who was suffer the consequences for execution the next day and was sending a bunch of damn you letters to the victim's family, as if they hadn't been through enough. Story 29. Not a prison guard, but my good friend is. This happened a week ago. 2 prisoners were shouting and eventually got into a fight, which led to a full-out riot. Where things got extreme was they ripped a TV out of the wall to get to the electrical cables and frayed them, then got bags of toilet papers and used the cables and toilet paper to create fireballs during the riot. Small fires were all over the place, as well as the classic shanks and bludgeoning weapons. Furthermore, all the prisoners used their pillowcases with eyes cut out so they couldn't be identified and proven guilty for anything they did, which led to them really removing any inhibitions. They basically had a room full of the KKK going full riot, beat each other and flinging fireballs. When the fire department arrived, they tried using the hose to get cellmates back into their cells, which somehow wasn't working. SWAT and pepperball officers were also brought in. I was watching from outside. It was quite spectacular. Story 30. I was a co about 18 years ago at a max pen from 14 to 24-year-olds. It was insane to me that such young kids could be locked up with adults. We had a lot of construction going on in the prison, and they would bring in older convicts to do the work. One day, a young guy started talking crap to an older one, and the older guy hit him in the face with a coffee pot. Lots of cuts and lots of burns. Another time, one of the construction guys snuck a welding rod back into the prison and used it to hit another inmate. I'll never forget that. Surprisingly, he survived. I was personally involved in 2 extreme situations. One came my first night being alone after training. A group of 5 inmates jumped me. First one hit me in the back of my head and I went blind for a second. I couldn't get my bearings, but I knew I needed to get to the unit door so the guard upstairs could let me out and lock them in. I ran for the door covering my head and luckily got out. When I was trying to shut the door, which was a large steel door with bolts that shot out to lock it when it got close to being closed, I shot one of the inmates' feet in it. It crushed his foot. IDK if they were able to save his foot. He was transferred from the hospital to another facility. Then one other time, a guy didn't want to go back into his cell, so he tried to fight me. We were on a balcony about 12 feet up. Imagine a second-floor outdoor hotel. There was a line of cells on the first floor with stairs on each end that led up to a line of cells in the second floor. Anyway, he was trying to push me over the railing. We wrestled for a bit, but when he tried to push me off, I started hitting him. In the scuffle, he ended up trying to run and jumped over the railing. I think he wanted to hit himself, but he landed on both feet, which broke both of his ankles. Prison is real lame for all involved. Story 31. Not me, but my mom is a prison nurse. She once had a dude swallow a balloon filled with substance, and it popped or leaked in his stomach and he overdosed. Story 32. Not me and not a prison guard, but one of my college professors used to teach at a prison. She was a Portuguese literature teacher for them. This happened in Brazil. She was teaching the inmates, all male, about poetry, and it was close to Mother's Day, so she told them to write a poem about their own mothers. This was in a very impoverished area, and she told us all the inmates were illiterate before she started with them. One of the inmates wrote a beautiful poem about his deceased mother that was passed right before he was arrested when he was much younger. He was arrested for hitting his father, who hit his mom and she passed. All the inmates started clapping and whistling because it was so beautiful and heartbreaking. But then the guards went nuts thinking they were messing around and started beating the inmates so they would shut up. Classes were canceled after that. My professor said it was all very shocking. It was a pure scene with people bonding and learning, and the guards resorted to violence without even thinking. She never went back to teach at a prison again. Story 33. I worked in a prison in Iraq. We were training Iraqis to take the prisons over. We had about 8 separate buildings, known as K-span. We had turned one over to the Iraqis just to see how they could handle it. They didn't do well. When we got the call, we were just about to get off a 12-hour shift. We were in the middle of a shift change, so both shifts were present. Apparently, the detainees thought this would be a confusing time for the guard force, but instead, it meant we had double the amount of manpower. Back to the call, the Iraqis had lost the whole building. Their detainees had started to riot, and one cell, which contains about 20 men, was able to break a hole in the cell and escape. Luckily, there are 2 more layers of razor-wired fence they have to get through before freedom. We get a call saying they need help at the K-span. We grab tasers, riot shields, and flexi-cuffs and start running. Of the 2 layers of razor wire to freedom, we are now inside the same layer as about 100 escaped detainees. From outside the fences, other guard force see us rushing into the riot and are all screaming, "Duck them up." It was a very charged situation. The run was about 500 yards. As I approach the K-span, I see the Iraqi correctional officers, ICOs, in the rec yard. They have makeshift weapons trying to defend themselves from escaped detainees and other debris from the building being destroyed. They were ducked. Detainees hated the ICOs, probably more so than Americans. They saw them as traitors, which if I were in a detainee's shoes, I would too. And now it was 100 versus 10, we can only see the rec yard, not access it. We had to run around to the entrance and go through the building to get to it. Basically, there was a riot of 100 men between us and the ISOs. We had to get the riot under control before we could help them. I was about the 10th U.S. Guard Force to show up. We immediately ran inside the building. It was chaos. Inside the K-span, there are 20 cells. 5 on the left side, 5 on the right side on 2 floors, 20 men per cell. Most cells, they weren't able to escape and were still inside. But one cell escaped and must have gotten keys as they opened about 4 more cells. All the cells on the lower right side were open, roughly 100 men. A single hallway ran the perimeter of the cells, so we sent a team of riot shields in each direction to corral the detainees back to their cells. One team went right, the other left. I went left behind my buddy, who had a shield. I had a taser. As we walked the hall, there are detainees in cells next to us and above us. They have igloo coolers they use for tea and are filling them with whatever body fluid they can produce and raining it down on us. The noise, the smell, the thunder of hundreds of men pounding on the cages next to us. Pieces of building and debris are crunching under our footsteps as we make our way around the left side. We are now at the back door of the building, which is the entrance to the rec yard. It was empty. The detainees must have realized there was no escape from the rec yard and came back in after beating the crap out of the ICOs. I didn't see them either. We shut and locked the door and continued around the perimeter hallway. We now made it around to the right side. Here we found all the detainees charging and getting ready to fight the other line of shielded guard force. The cells had a layer of plexiglass spit shields that have now been shattered into swords, which the detainees are now wielding. The 2 teams of shields began to come together, forcing the detainees toward the center. Most of the detainees gave up and simply went right back into their cells. About 20 were persistent and came charging for the shields, where they were easily detained. We finally pushed the last of the fighters back through the hole in the cell they busted out. These prisons were built cheap. The cells didn't have bars. They had a single layer of expanded metal grating as bars. They were able to beat a hole in it using an old man's crutches. It was about 3 feet in diameter. We got the detainees back in the cell, but now we had to go through and cuff them. My buddy and I were the first to crawl through the hole. He put his shield in first and followed behind it. There were about 15 men in there. Most had already given up and laid down, but 5 or so wanted to fight. I crawled through immediately behind my friend and immediately deployed the taser. Homie hit the ground. Funny thing about a taser is, I can still tase you with the gun portion after I've fired the leads. Only those leads still shock every time I pull the trigger. So the poor git I got with the leads had to get shocked again every time I had to use the gun to tase one of his buddies. It didn't take long for more guard force to get in behind us, so the detainees gave up quick. We cuffed them and began moving them out, then went to clean the cocktail of body fluids off of ourselves. This was all at the end of my 12-hour shift. What a day. The ICOs who originally lost the prison were okay. The detainees beat them, but spared them. They didn't come back to work as far as I know. Story 34. Aussie correctional officer. Most extreme would be seeing a mate and fellow officer narrowly get stabbed in the neck with a pen. Luckily, it hit cheekbone. He's a tough bloke who's been through much worse in the defense force overseas, and he was back at work the next day like nothing happened. Also, saw an inmate beaten by 2 other inmates over a substances debt. Inmate didn't move until a few seconds before the response team got there. Felt like forever, but was about 30 seconds. Looked dead. Funniest would be one of our more psychotic inmates in a death prevention cell. Toilet shower area were blocked off because he continually flooded his cell. Less vision. He's known for producing the largest craps you've ever seen. Gotta be known for something, I guess. Without immediate access to his toilet, he decided to lay the ungodly log in the middle of his cell for all to see. Without exaggerating, this thing was 2 Coke cans together. Easy. He left it for about 10 minutes and then proceeded to use his ripped-up t-shirt as a balaclava and gloves so he could pick it up. He then threw it with force at the ceiling, which is about 4 meters high. It stuck for a good 15 minutes. It took a lot of persuading to move him without use of force. He was handcuffed to the door to move him to a clean cell, and as the door opened, the log fell and made a distinct thud of the floor. Everyone, including the inmate, had a good giggle at the whole situation. Story 35. Not me, but my stepdad's mom, we'll call her Meg, works as a prison guard, and her husband, my stepdad's stepdad, we'll call him Steve, does construction and home renovation. Steve got a job to renovate a home after the previous tenant suddenly left and the place was found trashed. Carpet was ripped up, holes in the walls, garbage everywhere, the whole 9 yards. Now it was winter at this point, and the house hadn't been heated for a while, so everything was cold. He's clearing out the junk and grabs a big bundle of rug, all wrapped up. But it's too heavy for him to get by himself, so the guy he's working with comes up and they lug it across the room and throw it out the window. When it lands down below, it unrolls a little, just enough that a hand starts showing. Steve didn't even notice until a little bit later when they're moving all the trash into a big garbage can, one of those industrial metal one, and he sees the guy's hand. He had been hit, and after that pass, never heard how, and the guy wrapped the body up in the carpet. Fast forward a year or two and they finally found the guy who did it. He goes back to jail where Meg works. It's a small town where most people know everyone else, so the guy knows it was Meg's husband who got him caught and hates her. Fast forward a few more months, and he ends up being passed. All of this because he had somehow snuck substances into the jail and wouldn't share after his cellmate saw it. Meg said she didn't feel too bad about it. Story 36. My dad was a prison guard in Tennessee. Every Thursday was pork chop day in Max. When you have nothing, you live for the little things. One day, they ran out of pork chops, and a dumb crap guard tells the back of the line, "They're all out of pork chops. The rest of you duckers are getting bologna." Minor riot with a 6-hour lockdown, 2 broken bones, and like 10 people had to be treated by the nurse. Story 37. I used to work in a minimum security prison. One inmate decided that the medical staff weren't treating his diarrhea properly or quickly enough, so his solution was to shove an apple inside. Surprisingly, this didn't work out the way he thought. Story 38. I was a supervisor at an adolescent male sex offender secure level 5 facility. Beforehand, I was a regular co there for 3 years and never saw anything more than a few fights. My first Friday evening on the job, and we had the largest riot the facility has ever had. The first it ever had. 2 kids from the same unit attacked and pinned down a staff holding sharp pencil to him. They then whistled to the other units, which triggered 2 other residents to do the same on their unit. We had 2 staff per unit, a floater, and a supervisor for 40 kids. I ended up having to call the police, so come assist. They came in with guns blazing, and the kids dropped the attempt damn quick. Story 39. Not me, but me best friend who works in a clinic for forensic psychiatry here in Germany, comparable to a prison for the criminally insane. A patient had attacked another guard out of the blue. The alarm went off. Said friend and other guards rushed in, removed the patient, and got him into an isolation cell. Now here's the horrifying part. When they got back to help their injured colleague, they didn't recognize who it was at first, and actually thought it was another patient, because the attacker completely destroyed the guy's face. Story 40. Used work as a prison guard in Japan in '88. Some tall-ass foreign-looking kid just barges in and demands to stay in a cell, even though he didn't commit a single crime. Odd, but I wasn't trying to get into a scuffle with that beast of a bod. Fast forward a day, and I see this kid with a magazine, snacks, and a beer can. He just casually cracks open while his cellmates cower in fear. Odd. This was alongside his MILF of a mom just watching over right after getting shit on by her kid. This is where it gets interesting, though. My gun just suddenly flies out to my pocket and into his hands, where he proceeds to shoot himself, and the damn bullet stops in its place midair. At that point, I just wanted him out, but thankfully his British-looking grandpa and some Arab man in a robe came to escort him out. Most bizarre day of my life. Story 41. Not a guard, but a former incarcerated person. Saw a guy get beat about a dozen times. Aluminum bat beat down during a softball game over a call at first base. Guy head sounded like a watermelon getting crushed. Saw a correctional officer get savagely beaten with a shaving cream can in sock. Brutal. A padlock in sock beating of a cell thief. Saw another correctional officer get a protein bottle full of old piss thrown right in his face. It got in his mouth. Started puking instantly. Story 42. Not in USA. I knew a guy who did some time for substances possession on a tough prison. He told me about this kid around 20 who would get harassed and beaten by one particular fellow all the time. Story 43. I was involved in a multiple convicted murderer receiving a call that his father had passed. He was stoic as he talked to his mother. After leaving the sergeant's office, I escorted him back to his cell. He stopped in the hallway and asked, "Boss, is it okay to cry?" I said, of course. We paused for about 5 minutes and he let it out. Went back into his cell after. After everything I saw, it still reminds me they are human. Story 44. I responded to a fight in the shower where an inmate pushed the other inmate over the bench in the middle of the showers, jumped on him and hit his chin. I was also a trip officer that day, so I ended up escorting him to the hospital. On the way to the hospital, the ambulance hit a deer. I also hit the deer at 78 miles per hour. It had bounced from the ambulance strike. The van was damaged, but still drove. Story 45. Not quite the same, but my aunt was a psychiatrist in a women's prison in the 70 AS. They had a change of warden from someone reasonably reasonable to someone who was extremely unreasonable. One of the things she instigated was a work program to help landscape a garden for the prison. Naturally, a number of the prisoners decided to sign up with the change to be outside. However, it wasn't until after they'd signed up that they found out that it was replacing their usual rec time, meaning they had no breaks and more work. The warden was insistent that she have a flower garden for the prisoners to enjoy, as it would be calming. It just so happened to be facing her window. So diligently, the lady prisoners worked and planted flowers ready for the coming spring. So, along comes spring, and during the time that the flowers had, well, flowered, the warden had been on a 2-week holiday. She came back to a lovely view from her office window. "Duck off," spelt in begonias in 10-feet-high font. Story 46. Not me, but my dad, who was a warden for years. Dad opened up a prison that was developed by a for-profit incarceration company, and it was quite the crap show when my dad was brought on. Even the construction had problems. Things like you could see from the men's showers directly into the women's showers and vice versa. He had entirely new staff, new to correction, fresh out of the academy, besides him and his second. Anyway, the week the facility opened, the week they got inmates, Dad's second comes into his office. "You've got to see this, Tom." "See what?" "I'm busy, Bob. You really have to come down and see this." Dad goes down to the block, and inmates aren't exactly rioting, but they are all out of their cells, refusing to follow orders, talking crap, getting worked up, and Dad's green staff is cowering in the control room. 300 inmates are pressing into the doors, getting loud and rowdy. My dad looks at the situation, his staff, his second, says, "Stay on my 6, and wades in. All the instigators are at the front of this crowd, but Dad doesn't engage them at all. He elbows his way through, goes straight to the back where there are inmates who don't really give a crap, but like to watch the ruckus. The leaders of the proto-riot are stuck on the other side of the crowd, and my dad starts shouting command. "What are you doing out of your cell when we are on lockdown? Get back to your cell for roll call," etc. People at the back start to disperse, and that gains momentum until it's just the few instigators. And now you can deal with the handful left, plus they lost all their supporters. My dad is either really brave or really stupid, but prison stories are still my favorite. Story 47. From my co-brother. Some guy hit his head open and wouldn't cuff up to have the nurses help. He was being absolutely combative and going crazy. He covered himself. And the cell he was. He told my brother he was going to pass and to tell his family he loved him before passing out and apparently actually almost dying. He said it messed him up for a good while. Story 48. I was doing the rounds in my unit, supervising inmates that were utilizing the exercise area, indoor. As I rounded the corner to the basketball courts, I heard some commotion. I head toward the commotion, straight down the hallway, turn to my right. Through the mesh, I catch a group of about 12 or so inmates carrying a young, brown-haired male towards some gym equipment with a sock in his mouth. I call a code and I begin to corral these individuals into position, and my mates join me in de-escalating the situation. Story 49. I'm not longer a co, but worked for approx 5 years. Thank Gia, that's over. I was advised to move an inmate from strip to a different cell. Strip is an area that inmates that could harm themselves are placed and only given a smock suit. Also referred to as a turtle suit, the inmate was acting irrationally by growling at me and shaking the bars. I called classification back and told them due to safety, I will not move the inmate by myself. I also advised my supervisors of the same. Usually they'd get a group of 4 guys and do it as safely as possible. This LT shows up that thinks he's hot crap and says he'll move him himself. I'm like, whatever, go ahead, but I already knew it was going to go downhill. The LT opens the cell door and the inmate pushes him and runs past him butt-ass naked. I start chasing the inmate down a hallway corridor. He was sprinting naked right towards a dead end. The inmate finally gets cornered and starts growling and roaring like a lion. Being cornered with nowhere to go, he charges towards me. I used his forward momentum and dump him right on the floor. The inmate is still fighting and trying to bite me and hit me. The LT is just standing there like a git. Finally, my friends show up to help. The inmate fought for a good 30 minutes until he was injected by something by the EMS crew. He fought so hard he ended up breaking his ribs and ankle. He flailed violently, just threshing everywhere. Turns out he had received a substances that was laced with some bad crap. I talked to the inmate a week or so after. The substances was out of his system and he was like a different person. He ended up apologizing. Best thing was this LT looked like a giant idiot and a wuss because it was all on camera. He stood by as his officer was trying to restrain a violent individual. That's something you'll never live down in your career and it's remembered forever. Story 50. Was for a short time a co at a Level 3 institution in the South. 1. 23-year-old was refused a second peanut butter sandwich because he was no longer on a diet per the doctor, decided to get completely naked, cover himself head to toe in his own peanut butter, and hit one of my academy buddies in the shoulder with a paper clip. We then had to gas him and execute a forced cell extraction. 5 guys in riot gear had to take this guy down, which he was naked and covered in crap. This was my second extraction. Inmate was insulted by another and decided to retaliate by putting a cup of Vaseline in the microwave and then threw it in the guy's face, leaving him with serious third-degree burns on his face and in his mouth. Dude got his eye socket caved in shortly after that. 3. We held most of the cutters in the state. Story 51. Former state, federal, female corrections officer here. I saw a key fight among 2 male inmates in the common area of the housing unit. At the time, I worked for the state and at this particular medium security prison. The inmates are given an individual key to their cells. All of the cells are still behind a big steel door that only the corrections officers had keys to, so they were still confined within the housing unit. Anyway, something happened between the 2 inmates, and they did this thing where they placed the key in between their knuckles, so when they punch each other, the key acts as a brass knuckle. It was a whole mess, and I had a lot of paperwork to complete because... Story 52. Alright, so I was looking for a job some years back. Any job. I ended up catching on as a teacher in a youth prison. My job was as computer lab administrator, where they took pre-GDD and other computerized tests. There were some other teachers there as well that taught other classes. I was a staff member of the school portion of the institution. Tame, yes, but still a prison. I had to be searched to enter the premises. Phone had to stay in the car, etc. So I went through the general prison guard training for 2 weeks at another prison. Self-defense training, the whole 9 yards. I went through that with newly hired guards for the state prison, etc. I start my stint at the youth facility and everything is going okay. We're outside the fence on lunch smoking cigarettes. And one of the actual guards tells me there are 2 or 3 new students coming that day and asked me if I wanted to watch. Watch, I said. Watch what? He explains that when they first arrive, they shave their head and strip them down naked and really embarrass them. This place was a military boot camp style facility. The more he describes this process, I just get sick to my stomach. It was at this point that I recognized that while corrections may be a necessary part of our society, it is one that is certainly not for me. For a variety of reasons, I ended up leaving the job a few days later. Story 53. Okay, so in my prison, there is an area next to the nurse's station where inmates suspected of being suicidal or having a meltdown are kept, like a special observation area where med staff is close by. One Valentine's Day, I was on that post, and the nurse on duty was a pretty decent-looking woman in her late 20s, early 38s. We'll call her Jennifer. While I was doing the rounds, she comes running out of the special observation area. I tried to ask her what was wrong, but she just runs past me into the bathroom. It turns out an inmate had taken his poo and written "Jennifer, be my Valentine" with a big heart around it on the window of his cell. Story 54. Probably not the most extreme. That would be the fight where I thought a guy was dead. But I have a few. Worked a segregation unit for crazy inmates. One of the guys made crap paper mache with his own feces and newspaper to form like turd Play-Doh. He covered his door and food hatch with it. Another time it was popular to make crap bombs, but filling a halls, drop Ziploc bag with feces and urine, let it ferment for a couple weeks. Then when someone you don't like walks by, slide the bad under the door and stomp hard with your foot. Boom! A reeking 20 feet streak of excrement on the floor and your victim. I have more. but these two come to mind first. Story 55. Nurse at a women's prison for a year or so. Inmate cut in line for her bunk's microwave and put her ramen in. She got that microwave to the face about 30 seconds later. Had a psych inmate who chronically swallowed things. Forks, batteries, hair barrettes, razor blades. They were allowed to shave their legs. Well, after that incident, she didn't get to anymore. More fake seizures than I can even count, which isn't extreme, I guess, but incredibly annoying. Most of the prison was bunkhouses, similar to what you see in Oiton B. But some of our older areas did have actual cells. Had an inmate not come out for like 2 weeks, cells were open for Gen Pop. They were supposed to come and go to their jobs and group meetings. After so long, we have to do an extraction, where the guards suit up in gear. It was my first extraction. I was on hand because they may use Fox spray. I laughed at first because she was like an 80-pound Philippine woman against 4 dudes and 2 women in near riot gear and Fox spray. Then my jaw dropped because she took them on and nearly ducking one. My eyes still water thinking about it because the Fox spray definitely hit all of us to some extent. I've never flushed more eyeballs in my life. Had an inmate keep coming in with yeast infections to sick call. She kept denying activity or anything that could be the cause. Finally got the truth of it. She had made a sex toy out of Jolly Rancher candies. It took a lot of education to get her to understand that sugar inside is a no-go. Story 56. Mine is from a closed asylum. I was pretty young, about 19, and checked in for my first shift ever. I went to the door and rang the bell. There was an electric lock which opened remotely, but the door was also held with some sort of cautionary chain higher up, so it only opened about 5 inches. Anyway, I press the bell, the door swings open and is caught by the chain. Into the crack pops a head of a goblin, the craziest welcome I've ever got. Stayed in the job sometime before starting my studies. The guy welcoming me was the serial self-mutilator in residence who had just hit his head. Usually there was a door to cover the frame, but it was left open for him. About the guy. He was friendly to other people, but really was hell-bent on hurting himself. I ended up picking him up once when he jumped through a window. Another time I went after another patient for a second, and the guy immediately bolted to the nearest pine tree, caught some cones, and ate them before I could catch him. For anyone thinking inhumane practices, this was decades ago, and people were really just protecting the guy from himself. Story 57. For almost a decade. Worked segregation and psychiatric units for most of it. In the segregation unit, some guys are supposed to be allowed to rec together, and some are supposed to be kept separate for their or others' safety. 2 inmates that had been heard threatening each other were accidentally let out together. In the 90 seconds from the time their cell doors opened to the time we stopped the fight, one of the inmates had knocked the other down, kicked his head and stomach. Story 58. I worked in a county jail for several years. And the main one I remember was we had a mentally ill woman who stayed with us for a while. She was not one for personal hygiene in the least. During one altercation, she had removed every article of clothing and was screaming at a female officer, then stuck 2 fingers inside and scooped out enough yeast to throw at the officer. Luckily, it missed the officer and splattered on the wall. Then she laid down and shoved her dentures inside, grabbed her lips, and screamed, "My pussy wants to talk to you, know?" Funny thing was the dentures then got stuck in the mesh that was inside for whatever reason. So then, at the hospital after successful removing the dentures, she then snatched the dentures from bedside tray and shoved them back into her mouth, still covered in yeast. It looked like she had been eating cottage cheese Lmao. Story 59. My sister worked for 1 week only at the state prison as a nurse and quit. Why? There was this 20-year-old who got in trouble with the wrong sort. So for a substances charge, he was caught with a bigger amount he had planned for a party. He got thrown in with the major offenders for possession with intent to distribute. War on substances, right? So he goes and joins a gang like you do when you go to jail. They decided to use him. He was beat so much that he decided to jump at the top bunk and land on his knee. Story 60. We had one guy who was having extreme mental health issues. So policy is, we put them in observation and someone has to watch them 24 hours a day. Anyways, after we had gotten him into the observations, all they have is a mattress and a safety smock. He had razor hidden under his toenail was missed, and he pulled it out and proceeded pull out his balls and play with them. The officer watching him then called a medical emergency, and we then ended up taking him to the hospital to get everything fixed. And we then put him in Thudic restraints and placed him into a medical-induced coma to prevent him from hurting himself more. Story 61. I've got lots, but I will start with my facility had several cell configurations. This happened in a 24-man tank. There was one inmate that repeatedly stole from the other inmates and was caught red-handed. He was about to get his ass beat when one inmate stepped in to defend him. He reasoned that since all the stolen items had been recovered, that the thief should be cut some slack. The rest of the tank went along with it, but decided that if he was caught again, that the inmate who defended him would have to take care of it himself. Inevitably, he stole again within a week. The inmate used a broomstick to break both of his hands and beat him across the face so hard that he broke his nose, both cheekbones. When he was done, he called control for us to come get the pile that was left. The guy looked like a male orangutan in the face with the big flat cheek pads. His eyes were swollen shut. His tongue was so swollen that he couldn't fit it in his mouth. The medics had to give him a trach so he could breathe. Story 62. The most intense thing is between responding to a man hanging himself in a seg cell, human instinct telling me to open the door and cut the sheet, but training kicking in to wait for backup, or the first time I got to ride in a helicopter. An offender took the chain off of a weight bench and beat another offender with it. The victim held his arm above his head and blocked most of the attacks. He had to be flown out, though, because the swelling in his arm was so severe it would hit him. It never occurred to 19-year-old me that you could pass from a deep bruised arm. Story 63. The funniest thing I ever saw was still kind of disturbing. There was an inmate who believed that he had a demon in his sink. He begged us to spray the sink with pepper spray so the demon would go away and stop talking to him. He wouldn't shut up, and he was waking up all the other inmates in the hospital ward. I decided to call my sergeant. My sergeant came in and, after talking to the guy for a while, said, "Screw it, let's pretend to spray the sink with some pepper spray." My partner was a rookie, had only been on the job for a couple weeks, and he had a pepper spray container that looked like a small fire extinguisher. Rather than pretending to spray the sink with pepper spray, he actually fired it off. Its blast splashed back on us, so we were both coughing and slightly blinded. The inmate, who was handcuffed in the corner of the cell behind us, came rushing over, knocking us both out of the way, stuck his face in the sink, took a deep breath, and with pure joy in his voice yelled, "Yeah, take that, you mother ducker! Damn you! Now who's an idiot?" When he was done yelling at the demon, he started dancing around with glee. He calmed down and was happy the rest of the night. I had a Ghostbusters t-shirt made for my rookie partner that said, "I ain't afraid of no sink demon." Story 64. Not a prison guard, but a former paramedic in one. In this prison camp where I worked, inmates worked in a field on what was called a hoe line. The inmates were given tools randomly and lined up to work randomly. One inmate marked a tool, and every time he got that particular hoe, he worked on sharpening the side of the blade. He then waited until he had that tool and was lined up next to a particular inmate. He then used his sharpened hoe to hit the man's Achilles tendon and almost lost his foot. It turns out this was in revenge for the victims repeatedly stepping on the back of the inmate's foot as they were moved around the facility. Further, he told the guards that he had been planning and preparing for the attack for over a year. Story 65. My dad worked at the jail in Boston and has a ton of stories. I'm just learning about them now since I'm old enough to hear them. Once when I was 7, my dad came home covered in human feces because of a fight that broke out. My dad said one guy said they would own them or whatever, and one jail guard that worked with my dad said to him, "They're going to distract us and get you." And then a few hours later, that guy was begging to come out. Also, my dad used to bring home rubber pens because you can sharpen real pens into a weapon. My sister and I used to like the rubber ones. Picture the ink tube inside of a regular pen surrounded by rubber. No story there, just a fun fact. Story 66. I worked in the jail for a little over a year when I was a probationary police officer. Guy came in, disruptive, combative. We put him into the single-occupant padded cell until he would calm down to be processed, fingerprinted, pics, etc. Our policy at the time was you go in there stripped down. He begged me to let him keep his underwear and get me. I did. A few minutes later, I hear the trustees yelling for me to bring the keys. I grab them and run to the cell. I'm the only officer in that area on duty. The dude is trying to end his life. Damn. I fumble around with the keys while screaming at the trustees to hit the panic button, hidden button to inform the receiving desk officers I need help. Now. I get the door open, run in, and lift this huge guy wrapping my arms around his buttocks area to get some slack on his neck. He craps all over my right forearm, short-sleeve uniform. Other officers enter, climb up, and untie him. He coughed and sputtered back to life. I ran into him years later, and I recognized him, but he didn't recognize me. I told him I was the guy that you crap on. He apologized, thanked me for saving his life, said he was clean and sober now and seeking mental health treatment. Story 67. My dad worked at the Chino prison for years and told me a story he was going around doing checks. And as he was leaving a hall, a prisoner called out to him, "Hey, Smith," not his real name, and my dad asked him what. The inmate told him, "Come here." My dad, not wanting to deal with this, just says, "What? Just tell me." The inmate says, "Smith, I really need you to come here right now." My dad, a bit annoyed, goes over to him and says, "What?" The inmate then whispers to him, "You left your keys in that door. Go get them now." My dad looks, and sure enough, he had left his keys in that door. He grabbed them, and then gave the inmate a big thank you and slipped him a few packs of smokes. My dad says that inmates were typically good to him because he always treated them fair and with respect, but always made sure they knew he was the one in charge. Story 68. I work in a hospital near a prison. About 2 weeks ago, one of these guys got an extended stay with us due to sepsis after his wound became infected. Since I work in ICU, I was able to follow his case. Balls edema is pretty common in the ICU due to large amounts of IV fluid and the way patients are positioned in the bed. This guy's balls would not heal. The wound just festered and wept and stank. He eventually had to have surgery to remove a bunch of necrotic tissue. Almost pass. And he really just carried himself like a regular guy through his entire stay. Story 69. I used to visit jail once a week with my golden retriever, Cooper, who's a therapy dog. Any normal day, I was asked for cigarettes or to smuggle something in my next visit, as I was never searched or walked through a metal detector upon entry. Don't worry, I never did. Anyways, my last visit there was around lunchtime. I entered a cell with 6 inmates who were Southside Los Angeles gang members. Inmates always made the craziest concoctions of sauces. Each gang had their own recipe of sauces. And my dog bolted for a glob of their sauce that was on the ground. After he ate it, the whole cell erupted, saying, "Cooper is Southside! Cooper is Southside!" That chant spread to the rest of the cells. On that row, and then to the rest of the 7 levels of cell rows, 150 inmates. The jail went into riot prevention, and a lockdown ensued. Cooper was then listed as a gang-affiliated citizen, and we were no longer allowed to visit. Story 70. I'm not a prison guard, but a friend of a friend is. He told my friend when he's walking through the corridors, he can hear the people in for pedo watching TV shows for small. And the thing is, they can't really tell them to stop either. He said it's very disturbing. Don't really know if you can class this as extreme, but it's something all right. Story 71. Once got told a story from a buddy of mine that's a prison guard. This one dude had a colostomy bag. I guess those things have an open hole that requires some sort of frequent medical maintenance. This dude's hole kept getting infected and being torn, and the doctors were puzzled and had to keep him loaded up with medication to fight it off. This dude's hole kept getting infected and torn because he was getting cigarettes from his cellmate in return for letting him duck the hole. Story 72. Not me, but I got sat next to an interesting old chap on the plane. We got talking and his life sounded super interesting, and he mentioned how once he became a maths teacher in prison. Prison guards have read it. What's the most disturbing thing you've dealt with? My dad used to work as a co, and he would never tell me any stories about his time there until one day of constant badgering. He told me the tale of the Easter surprise. Easter morning, one of the inmates thought it would be a brilliant idea to get completely naked and shove a toilet scrubber all the way up inside, so the only part visible was his bristled bunny tail. He then proceeded to scream that he was the Easter bunny while trying to hop around and avoid the oncoming guards. Story 2. I would now say that being assaulted is the most disturbing thing I've dealt with. It happened last week. I was in a confined space conducting a search and was grabbed by the neck and slammed into the wall before I could react. I've been having nightmares since, and I just can't shake this. The other stuff I can disconnect from since it isn't happening to me directly. But this is a lot harder to deal with mentally. Really makes me look at the big picture and wonder if the crafty $15 per hour is worth everything we are subjected to on a daily basis. Story 3. My dad was installing a ventilation system at a women's prison. He had a nice chat and a sandwich with an inmate. After they said goodbye to each other, a guard told my dad that the woman was sentenced for life because she hit her husband and he passed. This happened in 78S, and my dad was working under very lenient regulation. My dad and his co-workers were merely told not to interact with the inmates, but there were no significant consequences for them if said interactions happened. Story 4. Oh boy, here we go. Trying to contain that situation with nothing more than Oki spray and gloves was a pretty grim welcoming to corrections. I try not to look at their charges because I find it hard to treat them the same after I find out that they are abuse offenders. Almost every time an inmate is polite and seems like a decent enough person, I end up hearing their case in the news and it is abuse charges. During a strip search, an inmate used his hands to make his butt cheeks say, "Excuse me, sir, but do you have a breath mint?" But by far the most disturbing thing is the complete lack of accountability. 90% of these guys have convinced themselves that they are the victims and have done no wrong. Never accountable for anything, and have a sense of entitlement that is more frustrating than anything to deal with than any other aspect of my job. I didn't realize I had become desensitized to it until I was threatened by an inmate telling me, "I'm going to hit you and abuse your wife." I told my family that it happened a few weeks later, just as a "oh, by the way" sort of thing, and they were mortified, whereas I had almost forgotten it happened. Story 5. I knew a prison guard at Winston Green in Birmingham, and he said the most disturbing thing about Fred West was how jovial he was. The officers kept forgetting and laughing at his jokes and stuff and then thinking, this guy abused his own daughter. Story 6. Not a prison guard. I work directly with the mentally ill patients, so this one guy's been pacing in his cell for a while, back and forth in front of the door. He stops me and starts chatting. I didn't understand him. He squats and digs something out of inside and starts chomping on it, licking this thing. He shoves it back up inside and pulls it out again, continues to lick and suck on it. I ask him, "What the heck was that?" "An orange peel. I eat them, crap them out and suck on them, then swallow it." Story 7. Not really disturbing in a traditional sense, but still made me uncomfortable. I'm a co at the Denver complex for the Department of Corrections, seeing James Holmes, the Aurora Theater shooter, come through our processing after getting sentenced. I'd seen this man's face and heard the stories for 2 years on TV, but seeing him in person just slapped me in the face with a weird sense of reality. I don't really know what I expected, but it was pretty disturbing to me personally. If that doesn't count, then seeing an offender hanging from a sheet in their cell. Story 8, former prison guard. I had to escort a new prisoner to medical. I had no idea why until we got to medical. He had bandages all over both legs, and he walked stiff-legged, couldn't bend his legs. When he sat down, the nurse started removing bandages to expose rotted flesh. He was an addict and was injecting in his legs. His legs were so swollen and gangrenous that the smell almost put me down. When he tried to bend his right leg, the skin split. The doctor looked at me and immediately called for another guard to come to the room. I asked what was wrong, and she said, "You're going into shock. I need you to leave before you pass out." Surprised at what she said, I protested, but she demanded that I leave. On my way out, I started to feel lightheaded. I looked in a mirror and noticed that I was sheet white. Story 9. I work closely with all the prisons in the state. There's one notorious inmate who likes to pleasure himself and throw his semen in everyone's face. Fellow inmates, guards, it doesn't matter. He's not strict to semen, sometimes piss and crap, just whatever he can get his hands on. Story 10. Not a guard, I was an inmate. This guy who was on the new, his first time in prison, not jail, decided to use the shower out of turn. Unwritten rules. He soon after was informed of his mistake. Not a big deal if you're new, and you only do this once. The next day he does so again. He wasn't in there for about 30 seconds when Bear walks in behind him. I hear Bear say, "Boy, you was told," and then came screaming and sobbing and screaming. 5 minutes later, new guy was bare-assed running to the bubble begging for help. The correctional officer, says, "Well, he did warn you." New guy was taken to medical and I never saw him again. I got tons more. Story 11. My friend's mom was a prison guard when I was younger. We went there our whole class, and she told us about how inmates would break down mentally. One story I remember her telling multiple times. She was on night shift and was suddenly alerted by screams of help. The screams came from a cell, and her being careful, she looked inside the door window. There, in the farthest corner, an inmate was on a chair screaming, pleading for help, and trying to avoid something on the ground. Mom, "What's wrong, inmate?" Inmate, "It's the chickens. Please get them out," while still standing on the chair, jumping and crying. Mom, "What chickens? Where are they?" Inmate, "Everywhere. Please get them out." So friend's mom opened the cell door and guided the invisible chickens out. The inmate calmed down, but as friend's mom closed the cell door, he screamed, "You forgot one." So she went back in and got the remaining chicken. Note, the inmate in this story was a big-ass biker dude. He was probably on substances, but I think it's a fun story. Story 12. Not a corrections officer, but I was an inmate in what they call gladiator school here in Florida. It's all inmates under 24 years old and with less than 20 years on their sentence. It's called gladiator school because if you don't know how to fight, you most certainly will learn. Fights go on all day long, so much that the sounds of fists to faces become as common as the birds chirping outside. The gang stuff was where things got really nuts. Attacks being scheduled so multiple in different dorms are being shanked simultaneously. People being hit with padlocks in socks or on the end of belts, at least a weekly occurrence. Some of the shanks, though, were baffling. It was really scary what these inmates could procure inside the walls of this state prison. Story 13. One of my old roommates worked in the county jail. He came home one day with a stone face, so I asked him how work was. All he said was, "I saw a guy eat his shampoo because he couldn't shower, then uncontrollably puke and crap himself. That's how my day went. Jail. Not for me." Story 14. I have two. One co-friend at a city lockup knew an inmate who everyone called the gingerbread man. He would get naked and cover himself head to toe in poop. He was trying to get insanity, but his crimes were substances dealing related. He was beaten rather badly a number of times by the 3 or 5 guys he shared a cell with. He stopped eventually, then went to real prison. Another co I know knew a guy who was kept solo because he kept trying to give people his HIV. He passed one night. Story 15. I was a co at a max unit for several years. I'll just make a list. Had a guy collapse in front of me and pass. He had a brain aneurysm. Had a guy try to connect his tattoo gun to the light. He electrocuted himself. He passed. I've caught people having sex twice. Once was willingly, and the other was for protection. I've been on the third row and the power went out. It was pitch black for about 20 seconds. Power loss was always the scariest thing to me. Had a guy who had come in with a relatively minor sentence, now serving over 100 years consecutively due to crimes he committed while incarcerated. He would attack any co he had a chance to. He was notorious for popping his door open and attacking co's. Had different guys try to attack the nurses on a few occasions. If you ever go to prison, don't so this. They're the ones who decide if you need to go to a hospital or go back to your cell and drink water. Had to fight a psych patient in the back of an ambulance on a transport. Had to sit through multiple surgeries because someone has to have eyes on the inmate at all times. Once I had to wrestle with an inmate when he was coming out of his anesthesia. He was out of it and freaked out. I have tons more, but I'm on mobile and it's a pain to type this much. Story 16. Former prison guard at a private juvenile detention center. The most disturbing thing I ever saw was not from the inmates, but from the prison itself. The kids were barely fed. Often dinner consisted of a single slice of bologna, one half of one slice of bread, a condiment package of jelly, and a half of an orange. Of course, when inspections or the parents had a visitor's day, there was much more food. I always wondered how they got away with it until one day I found out. I was working third shift and running the master control room, which meant that I had keys to the joint. I took a short break to stretch my legs, and during my walk, I'd wandered past the nursing office. I'd never really paid attention to it. So I took a quick peek inside and saw one of those old-fashioned scales that they have in every doctor's office. I thought it had been quite some time since I'd stood on anything but a bathroom scale, so I unlocked the door and gave it a try. The scale read something like 212 pounds, which was quite disturbing since I only weighed in the high 170s. Then it dawned on me. The private prison had bid so low for its services that they couldn't afford to feed the kids, forcing them to rig the scales to stay out of trouble. Story 17. Not a prison officer, but my dad spent 26 years working as one in the UK. Brixton, then Belmarsh. Heard a lot of crazy stories, including how the IRA prisoners used to. Mess strikes used to happen frequently. They used to cover themselves in their own feces, wait for the guards to go into the cell, and attack them. They then just started hosing them down through the service flap. Story 18. We had these things at the prison called mini-yards, pretty much fenced enclosures with a basketball hoop and a concrete floor that were attached to the galleries and separated from the main yard. At 8:15, the inmates would lock down, and by 9 o'clock, we had our count for the evening. After that county, no one was allowed to leave their cell until 4 o'clock when workers were let out to the kitchen. My first time working the night. I was sitting in the control center when the computer started pinging that someone had pushed the intercom button on the outside of the mini-yard. This, of course, freaked me out, seeing as how I had not let anyone out there. And anyone who wanted to get in from the outside would have to climb through 3 rows of razor wire. I brought up the camera feed, hoping maybe a maintenance guy for some reason had used a key to get in from the outside. There was nothing out there. I assumed it was a computer glitch and cleared the call. It immediately rung again. Still nothing on the camera feed. The button that was being pushed was used by the inmates to let us in the control center know that they wanted to come inside. There's also a speaker by the button that we can use to talk to them. I selected the intercom and spoke into, asking who was there. No answer. I decided I should call my lieutenant. At the least, this was a serious glitch that needed to be fixed. And at the worst, it was someone who had managed to stay out on the mini-yard hours after lockdown and was messing with me. So I called him and reported it, and all he said was, "Yeah, that happens. Just open the intercom and tell him that the mini-yard is closed," and then hung up. So I open the intercom to the seemingly empty mini-yard and say, "Sorry, the mini-yard is closed," in the same way I would tell the actual inmates on the day shift. Lo and behold, it stops ringing in. And this one, that really freaked me out. So this guy was working on a video monitoring at around 9 p.m. when he saw something moving out in a nearby cornfield. He pans the camera and zooms in on it and sees a black dog thing walking through the cornfield. No big deal, right? Just some animal. Then as he is about to pan the camera back to its original spot, the thing stands up on its 2 hind legs and sprints across the cornfield towards the tree line. I called bees, but since the video monitoring saves all its feed for 30 days, I was able to watch it during training with the guy. Story 19. I used to work as an EMT before the job became too stressful. I used to respond all the time to the local women's high-security prison. It was weird getting patients who seemed like nice people. And after a job, I'd look them up on Google and find out exactly just how violent the atrocities they committed were. But the worst thing I've ever seen was not an act committed by an inmate. We respond to a call for a heart attack. Charlie, which means we have to respond quickly. Our core was not 5 minutes away from the prison, so we got our driver, a crew member, and I, as the EMT at the time, respond. There is a lot of protocol that you have to deal with when you enter a prison. Your rig gets checked, so do your IDs, and there are multiple gates you have to go through. Of course, knowing the nature of the call, we asked for them to help us move more quickly through the checkpoints. The guards neither cared, nor did they seem like they even listened to us. Granted, I can understand it's your job, but when you have a patient in a life or death situation, sometimes greasing the wheel can be beneficial. Anyway, to make a long story shorter, because nobody really reads long ones anyway, it took us 40 minutes to get to the patient. They gave us the wrong floor that she had been on, and they seemed indifferent. The women ended up being down for over 30 minutes without a response. So I knew then that the chances of resuscitating the patient was not good. The anger I felt at the staff still gets me fired up today. That women might have been saved if we had gotten there sooner. Plus, when we arrived at the patient, the guards who had been there doing CPR before us had placed the leads from the AED on wrong and didn't shave the patient. Feel bad for saying this, but the patient was really hairy, and I know that when it comes to women, you don't necessarily think of a hairy chest. But you need to shave it if you see something. This is one of the reasons I'm not working as an EMT anymore. That and McDonald's employees make more than me. Story 20. Honey buns are routinely spent on services as a currency. Also, the amount of ramen noodles a normal college student eats in a week would make you rich as duck on the block. Story 21. Not a prison guard, but I worked maintenance in corrections. And on Super Bowl Sunday, a few inmates crap in the chili and tried to get the guards to eat it. None of them fell for it. Story 22. Not a correctional officer, but I did work as a PA for 8 months in a state prison. I saw an inmate shove 3 feet of an electrical cord up inside in an attempt to catch himself. Story 23. Inmates in a level 5-yard bunk up 2 to a cell. One inmate decided to pledge himself to his cellie for life by allowing him to hit his balls. Would not recommend. Story 24. Not me, but a friend who worked in a state prison down south. On his first day of the job, a very tall, very intimidating inmate stood over him and said, "I could hit you right now if I wanted to. Glad I don't work in a prison? I'd poop my pants." Story 25. A buddy of mine is a guard at a women's prison. He once has to confiscate a Jolly Rancher sex toy. These crafty women collected Jolly Ranchers and molded a rainbow-colored junk, then wrapped it in saran wrap from the kitchen and passed it around. Story 26. Not me, but my uncle. He has been a prison guard for 10 years. He has seen countless of things, but there was one thing that has always stuck with his mind. A little back information. My uncle is a chill guy. He is the kind of dude that would give inmates more minutes on the phone to call with their wife, provide them with a little extra comfort when they had it dire. Think solitary confinement, and was overall a human among imprisoned humans. This, of course, made him gain respect from the inmates, as he treated them like humans. However, in his last year, he substituted for one of his colleagues one night, and that was when crap went crazy. 5 inmates had very carefully planned out a breakout, which required a hostage. As they had some respect for my uncle, they didn't want to do it to him, and therefore specifically chose a day that he wouldn't be there. But yeah, they wanted to break out anyway. And if you set something in motion, you can't stop a roller coaster when it has already started going down. So they took him hostage, and one of the inmates said, while holding a gun to my uncle's head, "You aren't supposed to be here. Why the heck are you here?" My uncle was shocked. Quite logical if you ask me, and the other inmates made a run for it. However, 2 of them, the hostage, were shot in the knee, and that is when the inmates stopped the escape. Uncle made it out alive, had 2 paid weeks of, and went on a de-traumatizing holiday with wife. Story 27. I don't work corrections, but I still respond to local jails to complete assessments for inmates on death watch. Arrived just in time for sheriffs to locate a pass-in. After watching security footage, they discovered another inmate was beat him while they were ducking and the guy hit him on accident. Story 28. I'm not, but my friend used to be. He left. It got too much. He worked in the highest category prison, the worst of the worst. He told loads of stories, but the one that sticks with me was the time an inmate who was in prison called for help to see a doctor. The guards asked why, and he wouldn't say so. They said no. He kept on calling and they kept on asking why, and he wouldn't answer, so they kept saying no until he got real desperate. He didn't say anything. He was just curled up on his bed when he lifted the sheets up and there was blood everywhere. He'd been abused with some sort of instrument, and they tried to lost his junk. Brutal. Story 29. Inmate heated coffee and baby oil in cup for several minutes, then threw in dorm officer's face. I will never forget the screams of the officer, who unfortunately lost his eye. Story 30. Psych patient, after placed in an observation cell, pulls a razor out of inside. Multiple bad fights. Had 2 guys working with him help him walk the half-mile to the front gate. Worst by far was a SEG inmate slipping his cuffs, removing an officer's bean slot bar, big chunk of iron with a prong on the end we used to open slots in the cell doors to pass trays through, handcuff inmates, and beat him, was one of the first responders. I quit shortly after this one. Story 31. I had a professor who was previously a corrections worker who had a mentally ill man lay his junk out on the food tray. Door, magic portal. And she instinctively stepped back and kicked the tray door magic portal closed. If he'd been a little slower, he would have been a few inches shorter. Story 32. I worked at death row prison. We housed death row, ultramax to minimum security, and we had a special kind of inmate who was always in and out of ultramax, the special needs prison down the road. There was 4, all within a 10 minutes drive. I will never forget this inmate, Inmate G. He was always self-harming and causing problems to us and other inmates. One very busy, short-staffed day, I was assigned the ultramax unit. I dreaded walking in that unit as I normally worked Unit 5, which was medium security, so it wasn't a big hassle. Anyways, we are busting our assess off getting showers done and getting the inmates to the rec yard on top of delivering trays one at a time, only one pie flap open at a time. And Inmate G is up to his usual banging on the door and screaming. He wasn't getting his meal fast enough. He decides to set a small fire by making a stinger, paperclip or even notebook wire folded over to plug into the socket and have one end stick out to get hot. This is how they make their ramen noodles, and lights paper on fire. The Ultramax unit is set up so if anything is plugged in an outlet that sells power gets tripped. I go and put the fire out in front of his cell and write up a disciplinary report on him. The whole unit is banging on doors and screaming. Because inmate G has no power, water still works, and the other inmates are trying to get him to shut up. So with me having the most tenure, I get voluntold to go stop it. Everyone stops but inmate G. I radio in for someone else to assist, as 2 officers must handle an inmate in this unit at a time. As I'm waiting and standing in front of the door ready to subdue inmate G and take him to the discipline board to go over his extra charges, he decides to look me in the eyes and take apart a pen. He takes the spring out of the pen and starts hit yourself. I call the medical code over the radio, and the prison's elected responders come as well as the medical staff. Within the 2 minutes period for everyone to get to me, inmate G takes the spring and slowly inserts it into his penis. There is inmate G with a spring in his junk. We finally get him out of the cell and had to send him to the special needs medical prison down the road. That was almost an every week thing with him. Story 33. Now I wasn't a prison guard, but quickly hear me out. I worked in the emergency mental health unit of my city's hospital for about 2 years. The patients I was responsible for were the ones that were placed on something called a form. Most patients were on a Form 1, which meant they had recently tried to harm themselves. These patients were not allowed to leave the hospital and were essentially prisoners of the hospital. If they just made a beeline for the door to run, police would be called and they'd be arrested. So anyways, on with the story. One man came in. Kind of imagine a biker-looking fellow, big beard, leather jacket, ripped jeans, big boots, etc. So he came into the hospital complaining about his leg and that it was in pain. So the one nurse examined him and ended up sending him to me and placed on a form. He told me he was just in because his leg hurt. So I was a little confused. Anyways, my first job on a form is to get the patient to change into a hospital gown, collect their belongings, and lock them in a locker for them to get later. These patients obviously can't have anything like strings or hard objects that could be used to harm themselves or someone else. So he took off his jacket and I saw his arms. They were covered in what looked like paintballing welts. So he proceeded to take off his shirt, and same thing on his torso. There literally was not a 1-inch gap between the welts. This guy had so many. So I asked him and he says, "Oh, that's where the bugs come out of." So I was like, okay, does the doctor know about this? And he said he mentioned it to the nurse and she sent him over here. So he took off his jeans and of course, same deal on his legs. I took his jeans and felt something heavy in the pocket and pulled out a huge hunting knife. So I went over to the doctor, told him, and he came over and I swear his jaw almost hit the floor. He closed the door and talked to the guy for about 20 minutes. Turns out he was an addict and actually had bed bugs in his apartment. Story 34. I'll give you one. This is a Texas Max prison. Hazing is a big thing in Texas. The new guy always gets picked on. I was a newer officer to administrative segregation, an area of the prison where people are locked in their cell 23 hours a day. So naturally, all the hazing happened to me. On this particular day, I was at the control picket, where the switch to all the cell doors are, and I kept hearing a loud yell that went like, "Oh, way!" and an asterisk thud, 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 asterisk, over and over. I looked at my coworkers and they didn't seem concerned about it, so naturally I asked them, "Guys, what the hell is that?" My coworkers. "Dude, that guy might be having a stroke or something. Go check on him." I was kind of panicked. I ran over there to make sure the guy was okay. Big mistake. There was a guy in his cell who pleasured himself. The oboe sound was him moaning while he did it, and the thud sound was his junk banging against the shelf. He was absolutely abusing his junk. It was damn disturbing. I've never seen anything quite like it. My coworkers knew about it. He did it on a regular basis, and they thought it would be funny for me to see him doing it. Every time I worked on that wing and heard, ooh, thud, 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 I knew to stay the hell away from the cell. Worst part about the whole situation was I did the same thing my coworkers did to me to another rookie about a year later. Well, 6 months go on, and it was time for an institutional shakedown. We do a cell search on every cell. This guy's cell happens to come up. No noises. Cool. So, I go by his cell and notice this foul smell. I pull him out and lock him another spot. I go in his cell and his sink has got this rotten, disgusting liquid inside of it, filled all the way up, with his ass toy of a spoon next to his sink. His entire cell smelled horrible. Later on, come to find out all his food he was served to him, since he's in seg, his trays are brought to him. He dumped in his sink, filled it up with water, and let it ferment. That's what he ate. Rotten soup. Story 35. My father had already worked in the adolescent remand detention center for a couple years, but one day he had to cover for the security officer, whose primary job is to transport inmates from their cell to the security hearing, and then to carry out a punishment if needed, bring them to solitary, etc. My dad gets to work in the early AM, grabs his traditional morning cup of joe, and checks out the list of inmates to transport. A nice and easy one, he thinks to himself as he reads the first inmate's name on the list. Let's call him Carlos. He knows Carlos from the kitchen, where he cleans and occasionally serves food. My dad, nor any of the other co's, had ever heard of an incident involving Carlos, and nobody seemed to have a problem with it. Caffeine in hand and a hop in his step. My dad walks up to Carlos's cell, where Carlos greets him with a half-hearted smile. My dad says, "Good morning," and walks with Carlos to the security hearing. He sits Carlos down across the table from the board members, who would soon decide the inmate's fate. My dad sits himself down in the corner, reveling in the rare chance to relax and enjoy his coffee before the long day. Fast forward a few questions into the meeting. Discovered on security tapes that at 05 hours on Wednesday the 5th, inmate hash 079 washed his dirty shoes in the coffee maker and then went on to make coffee for the day. Upon further questioning, the inmate admitted to having washed his shoes in the coffee maker on a daily basis for the past several months. Cue the most epic spit take of my father's life. Needless to say, Carlos's reputation tanked that day. Story 36. I'm a correctional officer of just over 4 years, Lieutenant. Nothing surprises me anymore. I think a lot of us are that way. Kind of numb from daily exposure to a society that works nothing like the one I live in outside of work. I'll share a couple stories. One time, I was putting leg irons on a guy and I smelled what I thought was a fart. As I sarcastically thanked him for crop dusting me, I pulled his left pant leg up to secure the other part of a restraint device. A turd fell right on my hand. It takes a second to process the fact that someone literally just crap on you. Lots of crazy people in prison, lots of addict. One instance that sticks with me is when I walked into a unit and caught a dude smoking K2. As soon as I saw him, he started seizing out and fell and hit his head on the concrete floor. That sound. It runs a chill down my spine just remembering the dull crack followed by vomit. A couple months ago, one of my friends at another facility ended his life. He always seemed so happy. Coping mechanism, I'm sure. I never even knew he was suffering. I would have been there for him. Any way I could have. A couple days ago, one of my officers passed on the job. I wasn't working shift. His partner worked to revive him for 15 minutes until EMTs arrived. We're still reeling from this one. Having to run a facility while grieving a dude who should be there is a strange feeling. He was constantly ducking with me, and I loved it and hated it. I almost feel like this is some crazy joke, and he's going to pop back into Central and call me a dumb mother ducker for falling for it. He was my brother, Rip Jenkins. We love you. I'll see you Wednesday. Story 37. Not myself, but my stepfather just retired from working at a prison. His favorite story to tell people who ask what kind of attitude or mindset you need to have to work there is about himself when he was first starting off. He says that he was going into a room where multiple inmates hang out together, and he was looking for a specific inmate to take to medical for some reason. Well, a rather large Bubba-type inmate and 3 of his friends circled my stepfather. The Bubba asks him, "What would you do if we held you down and I got up and you?" Meaning he would abuse him. He said in his mind he was scared, but he didn't show it. He stood tall and looked him in the eye and replied, "One of us will pass trying." The large Bubba inmate stepped back, and another guard outside the gate started telling at them to get away from the guard. After that, he said he had no problems with any of the scary inmates. He said in his prison, as long as you didn't treat the inmates like they were trash, they wouldn't disrespect you, and if something happened, you'd have to stand your ground, or they would know you were weak. Story 38. I worked county corrections for a decade, and I've seen some truly disturbing crap. A few that stuck with me had a mentally ill man get arrested and brought into our facility. He was saying some pretty off-the-wall things, so the sergeant had us strip him down to his birthday suit and place him in the padded cell so he couldn't harm himself. Fast forward a couple hours, and this guy's mental state, combined with the substances he used, was rapidly deteriorating and becoming incredibly violent. This guy suddenly believes he has diamonds embedded inside. He believes if he can get them out, he can bribe us with the diamonds and we will set him free. Slowly but surely, this guy starts shoving his hand inside. We are well into night shift and don't have the staff to do an extraction, so we call for backup from the street deputy. Backup is 30 minutes out. This guy manages to get his entire fist inside halfway up to the forearm. He then rips his hand out really fast. He immediately shoves his hand right back up and pulls out again. He repeatedly does this while backup arrives and gets suited up into PPE. Extraction plans are laid out for a forcible removal to the hospital. EMS units are on standby. While everyone is stacking up on the door, this guy goes for the gold. We enter the cell. The guy starts fighting us. We manage to pin him to the floor and restrain him. Every one of us is covered in this guy's crap. Doctor had came in and forced him under with a sedative. EMS put him on a gurney to the hospital. Guy ended up surviving with a one-way ticket to the state hospital mental ward. Story 39. My wife works as social worker in a juvenile detention center here in Brazil. At first, she often told me about the youngs that she attend to, and told me cases that made my insides frozen. First is the case of a kid. He was kidnapped by tribal natives that was in war against some miners near Amazon. Then later after rescued, he was never the same. Started with substance. He was jailed because he and some companions robbed a car from a client that passed. Story 40. An inmate in segregation got very upset that he didn't get some paper a co promised to get him on first shift. Ducker lost of his own big toenail and hit his arm with it. Story 41. Not a guard, but I used to do service work in a federal prison. First week working in the prison, I'm with an escort in the United States Penitentiary, which is the big boy house. I'm with the escort walking outside while the inmates are in the yard, a fenced-in area. And then I start hearing a bunch of noise. A second later, I hear, "Get down! Get down! Get down!" followed by a nice "p'koo" from a rifle shot. While this was happening, my escort threw me and himself to the ground and waited till he heard the all clear. There was a fight in the yard, and the tower guard fired off a warning shot. I was working on equipment in the low facility whenever a guard's body alarm goes off, and my escort has to lock me in a room while he goes to see what was going on. He comes back 30 minutes later and tells me that an inmate had barricaded himself in a hallway and covered the floor in dish soap. The inmate's reason: he just got moved from the medium facility and didn't like that the housing units were open bunks instead of cells and wanted to go back. Not an inmate situation, but sort of disturbing still. I was working in the USP whenever they were doing a generator test. Lights went off as expected, but they didn't come back on. The generators didn't engage, and they were unable to switch back to outside power for some reason. The problem, aside from no lights to do my work by, was that the gates were all electric. I was stuck in the facility for 3 hours that day, locked in someone's office. I was on the clock, though, so it wasn't too bad. I get a call that one of the machines is malfunctioning, and I go to check. The problem is obvious. An alignment pin is missing. Not misaligned. Gone. It was a solid metal pin, about 4 inches long and slightly less than a dime circumference. A great prison weapon. I had to visit all 8 of the machines like this one in each facility after this discovery. 5 were missing. They found about 3 buried in the ground. They use a big electromagnet pulled behind a tractor to pull metal shivs out of the ground. It's really neat. And I think found another 2 stashed in a couple bunks. Story 42. Guy sculpted a parrot out of his own poo. He would place it on his shoulder and talk to it all the time. After 3 days, the smell was unbearable. On the 4th day, he refused to come out of his cell for a shakedown. He kept threatening to hit his parrot if we came in his cell. The second we opened the door to extract him, he grabs the poo parrot off his shoulder and bites the head off and chews it. That is probably the craziest, nastiest thing I've seen. Story 43. 1. I can kind of answer, though I must admit this was one of my old university campus security guards when I was in halls. Not me personally. She told me that she used to work in a British prison, and there was a new, young guy who had just started working. Basically, he pissed off one of the huge, muscular prisoners, and the prisoner held a grudge. So at one point, the guard was on his own, and the prisoner pushed him over. When he was on the floor, the prisoner basically stamped on his head a few times before he could restrain. She says she's glad to not be doing it anymore, but not all prisoners are that messed up. On another note, and kind of unrelated, the woman worked at the prison where Reggie Cray was held, who, if you don't know, was a huge London gangster in his time. She said he was a nice chap, and was always very respectful to her as she treated him like a human being. Because of this, he looked out for her, to the point where one time, another inmate told her he was going to hit her and do all sorts of nasty stuff when he got the chance. Supposedly, Reggie Cray heard this and told him to piss off. Then a day later, they'd found out the guy who had been threatening her had been beaten in the showers by some of the other inmates. She asked Reggie if it was him that made it happen, and he just winked at her and, "Nah, I wouldn't do something like that." These are all stories I remember her telling me when we used to have a cigarette together when she worked night shifts, as the security office was right next to my block. Story 44. Not me, but a friend of mine is a correctional officer at a jail, and I asked him this question after 6 months of him working there. He said there was an old man that barely spoke any English that hit his head on the wall and demanded to be airlifted to a hospital in Atlanta. His injury wasn't that bad, so they were able to treat him in the jail and tossed him in the padded room so he could not hurt himself anymore. Needless to say, he got what he wanted and was airlifted out of there. Story 45. Went on a field trip to a correctional facility, and one of the guards told us about how there was this one prisoner who would constantly cover himself in his own feces. He didn't stop there, as he would end his life still covered in crap. Story 46. I had to do a maintenance job at the Adex Correctional Facility in Florence, Co. If you're unaware with this prison, it's known to be the highest security prison in the world, housing people such as the Boston Bombers and other high-profile criminals. But we were escorted by 3 prison guards throughout the facility, and they said that nothing really happens there, since all the prisoners are on such high security lockdown. Although the normal high security prison next door that we walked through was extremely nerve-wracking, and the guards wouldn't tell us everything, but had a few bad stories. The guards also all wore stab vests, which they said didn't really help, since now the inmates just aimed for the face and neck. Story 47. I was going through my jail ops class after academy and heard a backstory to a guy I had arrested a few times for shoplifting. prior to the academy. The guy had spent a large amount of his county jail time in medical. The reason was because he kept putting razor blades into his urethra. He would break the disposable razor, 2-blade maximum, remove the razor blades, and shove them inside. He would do this for days. You can only buy so many shaving razors per week. He would get medical treatment against his wishes. He would recover, and the process would repeat. If he couldn't get razors, he would use broken plastic fragments from pens, paper, dried feces, or whatever else he could shove up there. Because nobody stays in county jail forever, I still see the guy around town occasionally. Story 48. I've worked as a police officer and corrections officer. Combined career time is about 12 years. Anyway, I don't know what I would consider the worst thing I've seen, as after a while, you kind of get desensitized to a lot of things. Many of the inmates that I have seen do some disturbing things were either suffering from mental health issues, substances-related mania, or both. Some of the things I've seen were inmate in a mental health segregation cell punching his mattress, yelling at it, then having act with it. Inmate taking a dump, grabbing it, examining it, then eating it like a Snickers bar. Inmate walking up the steps to the second tier, climbing over the railing, then jumping headfirst into the concrete. Inmate taking a dump, smearing it on the wall, then licking the wall. Story 49? Started working corrections in 2001. Here are some stories. My second month had an inmate have a massive heart attack and die, preformed CPR for over 45 minutes until the squad showed up. Had an inmate segregated cause he was 10, 96, crazy, liked to chew his own crap, place it in an empty toothpaste tube and stomp on it when you walked past doing rounds. Had an inmate transferred in from another state. When he got off the transportation bus, he was sweating very hard. It was winter, so it was odd. We dry celled him for about 20 minutes. We hear this dull thunk in the bucket, and he came to the door looking relieved and said, "I'm done." Removed the inmate and the bucket from the cell. Inside was a capped metal pipe about 8 inches long. It contained 3 saw blades, a cuff key, 2 razor blades, and a shank. The facility I worked at had a riot. Burned the administrative building, canteen, kitchen, mailroom, record room, and laundry. Took us 9 hours to regain control of the facility. I was slapped with institutional need and spent 2 weeks locked in a pod, sleeping in a bunk, showering in a day room, and eating bag lunches. I left after the riot, had some PTSD issues, but it's all gone full circle. I now am a deputy sheriff. I have more stories if y'all want more.